Welcome back to a brand new episode of the Animal Liberation Hour, where we bring you fascinating stories of creative activists in the animal rights movement. My name is Shriya, and I will be your host for today's episode. I sat down with the one and only, the Cranky Vegan, also known as Jake Conroy. Jake is known for his impassioned grassroots activism and his key role in the Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty, or SHAC campaign. This campaign made the headlines for taking on the notorious animal experimenting company, Huntingdon Life Sciences. In fact, the campaign was so successful that it threatened the animal exploitative industry with their strategies, to the extent that the SHAC team was ultimately incarcerated. This story was the center of the film The Animal People, executive produced by Joaquin Phoenix. Despite being incarcerated, Jake remained undeterred from spreading his valuable insights about the importance of tactics and strategies to inform our activism. In this conversation, we talk about the need for unity in the animal rights movement in order to be effective for the animals we are fighting for, and centering liberation for all Earthlings. Before we get into this episode, I want to remind you that the Animal Liberation Hour is a project of the Animal Activism Mentorship Program. AAM is a free multinational program that helps aspiring animal rights activists find their voice in the movement and take their activism to a whole nother level. From one-on-one mentorships to free workshops and trainings to this podcast, AAM seeks to empower humans to fight the good fight for all Earthlings. For more information, visit animalactivismmentorship.com and follow AAM on social media. That's Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship. You can also keep up with the Animal Liberation Hour on AAM socials as well. Animal Activism Mentorship is so honored and proud to be fueled by farm animal rights movement. And now to our episode that will ignite that smart activist spark in you. So thank you so much, Jake, for taking the time to chat with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Oh, the pleasure and honor is ours as always. So yeah, I wanted to, before we dive into all of the really mind-boggling questions that I have and that a lot of our members have for you, just wanted to start with, what really got you down the animal liberation and animal rights path. What was that initial spark and what was that journey like for you?
Yeah, for me, it really started with the arts, particularly music. I spent my elementary school days reading books about the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, because I grew up in a very suburban area, pretty white. So that was the kind of the history of the civil rights movement that we were given, a very kind of like, nonviolent, passive resistance type of thing, which is important, but it wasn't the whole picture. And so it really was, after devouring all these books as a kid and being really interested in it, it wasn't until I got involved or interested in music, particularly hip hop in the mid 80s, that kind of opened my eyes to like different aspects of the civil rights movement. So I started listening to things like Grandmaster Melly Mel and Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, NWA, and it was Public Enemy's Fear of a Black Planet album that came out when I was like 14 or something, 13, and I got that album, and they were on there talking about Black Power and Black Liberation, the Black Panther Party, Malcolm X, and all these things I never heard about, this other piece of the civil rights movement. And so that kind of opened my eyes to the idea of like, there's a lot of different ways to achieve change and a lot of different avenues and stories that we just aren't told necessarily, depending on where we grew up or how we were raised or educated. And, my interest shifted some or included hardcore and punk rock music when I was about 15. And back in the early 90s, mid 90s, animal rights and animal liberation was a really hot issue in that scene. And so that kind of fueled my interest not just in animal rights and veganism, but animal liberation and direct action and things like that. And it was a much longer story, which I won't bore you with, but it really was like that art, the music, and the media, finding the zines, and pre-internet days, of course, like you couldn't just go up on the internet and look for old information or interesting things from the history of our movements, like, having to find zines and old videos, from the 80s and 90s, and watching these images and videos of people rescuing animals and engaging in really interesting grassroots protest campaigns, and seeing how that worked really sparked my interest in activism, particularly around animal rights.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I know that you're not the only one who was inspired by the arts and the punk scene. I hear that as a common intro into animal rights and animal liberation during that time. And is that something that you find is that something that you think is still present in today's environment of animal rights, like that influence of the arts and animal liberation, or do you feel like that has shifted?
I think it's shifted with the way that we as like a society consume media in the world around us, which, I mean, that's a natural progression, right? Like we're always moving on to the next thing and the bigger thing. And so obviously like social media is really the big thing, and online presences and influencers and things like that. And so I think that's kind of what we look to be inspired these days. Some of that other stuff still remains, but I don't think it's as prevalent as it used to be. Or perhaps it just felt bigger back then because there was nothing really to compare it to, because there wasn't social media and the internet. You couldn't go out and be like, oh, the millions of people involved in the hardcore punk rock scene, that it isn't really a millions, it's maybe a few hundred of us, but it felt much bigger. So maybe that's the case. I think, society grows and shifts and changes, and cultures shift and change and grow. And we figure out ways to keep up with it and adapt to it and hopefully use it successfully to make the change we want to see. But I do think that, with the rise of social media and online presences, comes the rise of influencers. And with the rise of influencers comes the idea that you can make money and you can be gifted a lot of things and put on pedestals. And with all that comes funding, just like, nonprofit organizations. When you get a certain level of money and influence, you don't want to lose that, so you kind of continue to toe the line. And I think that's, to me, that's one of the starker differences between that DIY hardcore punk rock, we don't care about authority and all that world, we shun that world in order to make radical change, versus what it is now is like, it sounds good, but also I want, money and gifts and influence and power. So, I think maybe the priorities and interests have shifted, which is unfortunate.
Right. No, that's a very valuable point, and it's an important critique of the movement. And you talk a lot about strategy and how we can use our past experiences or past historical social justice movements, learn from them, and allow that to inform how we strategize our actions moving forward. And since this is, animal activism mentorships podcast, and we really want to emphasize on mentorship and what that looks like, I would love to hear about who have been valuable mentors in your life, and also how, just the way that you frame it, I had this abstract concept of, hey, like our past animal rights movements, how are they, quote unquote, mentors for current day activists, and how can we use the wisdom from the past to guide us to be more effective for the animals?
Yeah. First of all, I think like mentorships are really important, and I don't think they exist in the animal rights movement as much as they should. So I'm really appreciative of the work that you all are doing. For me, when I first got involved, I did a lot of reading of movement history. I wanted to learn more about the campaigns and the actions, and not just in the United States, but also in other places like England and Europe, where things were really like kicking off over there. And so I wanted to learn from all of that and from all of those people and be inspired by them. And so for me, it was, now we look on the social media world where we're like, oh, I worship this person. This person's my hero. I look up to them, blah, blah, blah. I wasn't interested in any of that. I was interested in like, how do I become friends with these people? How do I learn with them? How do I organize with them? And how do we grow together? And so that's what I was much more interested in doing. And that's still how I am today. I certainly have people I admire and look up to, don't get me wrong, but when it comes to like activist spaces, I want to find people that not just inspire me, but also are like down to just be friends so I can learn and perhaps organize with. And so, early on, a lot of those people that I got wisdom from and mentorship from were animal rights activists, had been doing it since the 80s and had been involved not just in animal rights, but also, radical environmentalism and forest defense, and helped me at an early stage in my activism to realize that like these pieces connect, indigenous struggles, things like that. And so I kind of started dabbling in those activist spaces as well with the help and support of these other kind of mentors. Nowadays, I think, there's been people in my life that I've really appreciated and have really helped me out in really difficult times. I was incarcerated for several years. And so when I got out of prison, it was, people that were part of like radical underground movements in the 70s and 80s that had gone underground and like spent years and years and years in prison for really radical stuff, and now are out and, organizing in their communities. And, these people are in their 60s and 70s and have been doing this for 40, 50 years. So talking to folks like that and being like, hey, how did you make this work? How does your activism look different? How does that make you feel? How do you adjust to that emotionally and psychologically? A lot of these people in the 60s and 70s, they were robbing banks to like fund the revolution and, trying to break people out of prisons and things like that. And now they're like, wow, now I went to prison and now I'm kind of like, organizing my community movie nights. And so like being like, how do you go from these radical spaces to these also really important things, but like, trying to break someone out of Leavenworth prison with a helicopter and dynamite to moving on to doing like speakers and movie
a potluck
nights
or something.
Yeah, both equally important, but like what a difference. Like how do you
Absolutely.
navigate that? So those conversations are really important to me. But a lot of the people that I take mentorship from now are people outside the animal rights movement, people that I've become friends with and organized with, and I just think are really smart and on the ball, and they ask difficult questions about the animal rights movement because they're not a part of it. And so being able to have those conversations where we can talk critically about each other's ideas and movements without, being judged, I think is super important. So I realize you asked who my mentors were and I didn't give you a single name, but that's
I mean, you gave like a general idea of what a mentor figure would look like. So
yeah, I think, you have someone
there's a name that you're really wanting to give out. That's fine too. It's all up to you.
Sure. In my earlier years, like people like Jonathan Paul, who I'm still friends with today, he really helped shape me as an activist. People like Cressida Lucci, who isn't involved in animal activism and still an activist. He was really kind of inspirational to me. People like, when I got out of prison, people like Claude Marks, who was, one of these people that had spent time underground and was now organizing the communities. He was incredibly helpful to me. And now people like my friend Georgia Hursty, who runs an organization called Frailty Myths, and she also works in the environmental movement, is really important to me and has really taught me an awful lot. So there's a lot of people that in the animal rights movement, you're going to be like, who's that? And that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how important they are, how big they are. If they're giving you, if they're able to have conversations with you and hold space with you and challenge you and befriend you and care about you and grow with you together, then to me, like that's an important mentor.
Absolutely. And I love that mentor as a friend relationship. And that's also what we really strive for in AAM, is to not have that hierarchy of like, you're the boss and then everyone else are the underlings and then the mentee comes under that. It's it's leveling the playing field so everyone's empowered and everyone is inspired, and we learn from each other, because we're all different. We all come in with different stories and backgrounds, and which is why, just the fact that you just seeking guidance and inspiration, not just for the sake of advancing the animal rights movement, but just because that's just the decent thing to do, is to support one another and each other's causes, and expanding outside of that and really engaging with these different members of the community, and like you said, allowing space to be critical and supportive of one another's movement is a very important thing that I think often gets overlooked in any social justice movement, for that matter. And I think it is very important to acknowledge that everything is connected, and helping each other is only going to make it better, right? So
Definitely.
yeah. And you mentioned your experience being incarcerated, and if you're willing to share, what was it? How has your activism evolved then during? Well, I know during you probably didn't do as much activism, and then post, once you came out and now you're seeking guidance from all these people, all these incredibly inspiring people. Just how has that shaped the activism that you do and the campaigns that you are following at the moment?
Yeah. I think my heart has always been and will continue to be in the grassroots movements, animal rights and beyond. I think grassroots activism is where it's at, where I think we can see really tangible and obtain really tangible results. I think it's also a place where like you build community, like there's beauty in people power. And with people power and small communities can come a lot of radical ideas and radical activism. And I don't mean radical in just like, a militant kind of way, like reinventing the way we treat each other, the way we care about each other, and live with one another and grow our communities and cultures and societies. Like that is like revolutionary. That's radical. And I think all that really starts in the grassroots. So my early activism was really rooted in animal rights, and it was very rooted in radical do-it-yourself grassroots activism, running, pretty quickly getting involved in pressure campaigns. And that looked like closing down fur salons in the Seattle area. It was doing hunt sabs, stopping hunts. And it moved on to working on a campaign called Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty, trying to shut down an animal testing laboratory, which was a pretty radical campaign for a variety of different reasons, not just in the tactics and strategies, but just the general idea that like a small group of people can come together globally to go after one of the world's largest corporations of its kind and decimate it in a short period of time is a radical idea, and it happened. So like all of that seemed very exciting, is very exciting to me. I would like to see more of it. When I was incarcerated for participating in the SHAC campaign, I got sentenced to 4 years, which I did in 2 federal prisons in California. Activism in there, I mean, in the broader sense, like I think I suddenly had to take care of myself. Like I think for a long time, I wasn't taking care of myself, wasn't thinking about myself. And so I was suddenly in a position where I needed to take care of myself, not just mentally, but physically, for my own safety. And so figuring out how that looks and operates in prison was new for me. And I learned a lot from doing it. There were times like, in prison where we did kind of organize a little. It wasn't huge things, it wasn't huge victories, but, there were times when there were, workers would essentially go on like a lay-in, which is like a strike. And so, in a sense, like you're participating and supporting those workers by being involved in that. We, organized across racial divides in prison to try to get this correctional officer removed from the prison because he was really awful and terrible. I mean, they're all awful in their own ways, but he was really one of the worst of the worst. And we kind of organized across these gang lines and racial lines to like go up against the warden and the assistant warden to get him removed, and we were successful in doing that. So there are little things like that, right, that you have to count as victories to keep your spirit up. But then when I got out of prison, I get put on probation for 3 years, where that effectively takes you off of, it takes you out of the ability to engage in radical activism and grassroots organizing, because if we get arrested again, then the consequences are a lot harsher. So that meant that I had to participate. I didn't have to, but I decided to participate in other movements outside the animal rights movement, so that I could operate more as like a participant rather than an organizer. And I found that super helpful, because it allowed me to kind of take a step back. I didn't have to be in an organizing position. I could just participate, but it also let me learn about other movements, and more importantly, like see how they organize, and see the tactics and strategies they use and how successful they are and using those tactics, and what were failures for them, and figuring out how we can kind of not just bring that back to the animal rights movement, but how we can incorporate animal rights with their movements as well, to kind of break down those barriers between the movements. And there are big barriers between the animal rights movement and every other. And that's a struggle for sure. But I think, it really kind of solidified the feelings that I had when I first got started about the idea of it's not just about animal rights, but I think being a little bit more active in those other spaces made me think heavily about not fighting for animal liberation, but for fighting for liberation. And so I think that was the adjustment that I made post prison and where I'm at today.
Yeah, wow. No, that's understandable. Like when you actually sit to think about the whole process and it all coming together. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
And yeah, you mentioned, your channel and your page, the Cranky Vegan. I'm sure a lot of our listeners might be aware. Thursdays are our favorite days. We tune in, we catch up on all the insider info, and you talk a lot about strategy and tactics, which is so valuable, and we try to really take that in and allow that to inform how we plan events and demos, etc. But one thing that I also wonder is there are so many forms of activism that we're seeing right now, like, people opening a vegan restaurant, or people wanting to just do the outreach, or like start a plant-based school, or just so many, or people within the law community getting creative with with passing legislation and all of that. So with all of that, that's sort of gaining attention, and even like starting your own entrepreneurial venture. Do you feel that that's taking away from the potential of the grassroots strategy, which could be far more effective in accelerating the pace of change? Or do you also see these other avenues as promising ways into the future that we're wanting to see?
I think we need to use every strategic tool in the toolbox, every tactic that's going to be successful, is going to work and play a part, we need to use. And so I think that's going to require lots and lots of different people with lots and lots of different skill sets. And that means people need to figure out what they're good at, what they're passionate about, and how they can ramp that up and use it appropriately. I feel like I've done just about everything that you could possibly do, from organizing pressure campaigns on like a local, regional, national, international level. I've done direct action through UNSABs. I've done civil disobedience, protests, home demonstrations, disruptions, educational outreach, I started a successful vegan plant-based food blog. I started a radical animal rights magazine called Bite Back with a couple of friends. And so I feel like I've kind of run the gamut of like all the different things that one could
I need
possibly
to
do.
find this food blog that you speak.
It's pretty, I mean, it's called Plant Based on a Budget. I helped start that. So,
Wait, really?
Yeah.
With Tony? Okay. Oh my gosh, I didn't know you were a part of that. That's interesting.
I'm not a part of it anymore. Yeah, it was her idea, and then she and I built it up from the ground, and then she's taken off with it in really great ways. But yeah, so like it takes all those things, right? And I think I always say that like organizing is like putting a puzzle together, right? We have to recognize what a strategy is, what a tactic is, and how to use them appropriately. I don't think that's something we have a firm grasp of in the animal rights movement. We confuse tactics with strategies, but the strategy is basically how are we going to put all these puzzle pieces together? And the puzzle pieces are all the tactics: educational outreach, protest, writing, web design, graphic design, lawyers, accountants, everything. And those are all the puzzle pieces, the tactics. We need to put all those tactics together to form this bigger picture and to win. And so, yeah, I always say that like some of the most important things you need on a campaign are what people would think were probably the most boring jobs and no one wants to do. And everyone's like, oh, I want to rescue the dog or climb the fence or yell at a bullhorn. Like, yeah, all that's great, but like
someone's gonna have to drive the van there. So
someone's got to drive the van. They got to have a good driving record. Someone's got to do the legal homework to figure out if you can do those things or what happens if you get arrested. Someone's got to make sure they file the taxes that year so the nonprofit doesn't lose its status or get audited. I mean, like all these things are super important. And so finding out what you're good at, but also what you enjoy, and then just doing them. I like for the SHAC campaign, as exciting and powerful as that campaign was, most of the time I spent on that campaign was in organizing meetings and designing web pages and leaflets and flyers and videos and posters and stickers. And, doing that for 15 hours a day, every day for 5.5 years isn't like the most like the sexiest form of activism or something we consider on or romanticize, but it had to be done. And all that stuff was super important in obtaining the things we wanted to obtain. So, yeah, I think figuring out what you're good at and doing it to your best of your ability is super important.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it sort of leads me into my next question. And this is something that I've also been thinking about quite a bit with, platforms like Faunalytics, and where they present the data and it's all empirical data to show what, for example, what may have been effective versus another, what approach would have been more effective in different arenas of activism. So do you think that if there is some, very comprehensive data that shows that, hey, this is the one thing that's going to get animal liberation tomorrow, but that might not be what draws someone into it, or it's not their calling, do you still feel that it's a moral imperative to do that, or should we still stick to whatever it is that our initial inkling was?
I don't think there's one thing that's going to end in animal exploitation tomorrow. So what I do think though is that there is a lot of like empirical data, and I really enjoy Faunalytics. But I also take that with a grain of salt. Like they do not have the answer as much as I don't have the answer. I think it's super important to look at statistics and numbers and facts and data and research that people like Faunalytics are doing to help guide us. But I also think like real life experience is super important. And I think, as much as we can say like, oh, this study points to this, we can also say, but also we've run 20 campaigns similar to this in the animal rights movement, and the outcome was different than what's being shown on these data points. And I think we see that play out in vegan outreach, right? So we see groups like animal charity evaluators and others who have in the past have been like, well, if we hand out 10,000 flyers, then statistically speaking, 10,000 people take this many flyers, and 10% of those people will read the flyers, and 10% of that will change the way that they are based on. So if we hand out 10,000 flyers, and that will equate to 112 people going vegan for every 10,000 flyers, whatever it was. And this party line sometimes is still talked about. Yeah, it works on paper, but that's just not how the world works. Like, you can't just be like, oh, if I hand out 10,000 flyers, I'll make 112 vegans. It's not how it works. And if that were the case, like, we would have way more vegans in the world than we already have. And I think, things like that don't take into consideration, like, people lie on these studies. People feel peer pressure to say things that they think that they should be saying. People say that they went vegan or plant-based, and then they stop a month or 2 months or a year later. Like, you just don't, like, these pieces aren't factored into, like, a lot of these studies and research. And so I think we have to use common sense, history, and our own experiences to weigh and balance out these studies as well. But really, it's up to each and every one of us to do, what we think is right, and what we think is important, and what we think will win the fights we're trying to win.
Definitely. And just kind of going off of that, when we have the signups at certain events, and it's like, okay, you're taking the pledge, or there's Veganuary, and people sign up to be vegan for however long, or plant-based for however long. And like you said, they may or may not stick to it, and we don't know. And we need, like, are we tracking regularly? And like you said, even if we do, are they lying on these surveys, because they're usually self-reported? So do you think that there is an effective way to ensure a sustained systemic or behavioral change in either within the outreach space? Because it seems like outreach is a strategy to or a tactic for behavioral change, versus pressure campaigns can drive more systemic, large-scale, top-down change. So I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah. Just to back up a little, I speaking of, like, sign-up lists and things like that for Veganuary and so forth and so on, as someone that works for a medium-sized NGO, those lists aren't just for trying to get someone to go vegan, for instance, or to pledge plant-based diets. It's to build up Veganuaries or $1 Million Vegans email lists, so that they can fundraise off them. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. Like, every organization needs money in order to survive.
Yeah.
But I think that, like, we often look at these things as like, oh, we're making a list to see who's vegan. It's like, well, we're making a list to see who we can fundraise off of. And I would imagine that if you get someone to pledge to be vegan or plant-based and then they stop, I would imagine guilt might drive them to donate a couple bucks now and again. But that's just me being a little cynical. But I do think that, like, there's more to those lists than just like, you're taking a pledge. Now I've forgotten the original question, but I think I honing it. I think educational outreach is an important tactic. I don't think educational outreach in the animal rights world is going to build systemic change by itself. It just isn't. We've been doing vegan outreach for decades in the United States to not a lot of great success. Everyone likes to say, I see so many things in my supermarket, but I mean, let's be honest, like, that's not because we're out there handing out why vegans and talking to people about animal rights issues. I think we have to be realistic about what we can and cannot achieve. And so for me, in the grassroots movement, I just don't think the grassroots movement should engage in vegan outreach full stop as a strategy, because we just don't have the abilities to do it, the means to do it, the resources to do it. There are large NGOs that do great jobs doing vegan outreach, because they have the money and the people power, and they can have people going out there and pushing these things, not just in lifestyle change issues, but also, trying to get laws changed or policies passed. That's just not what the grassroots movement does or can do. I mean, they can help in those regards, but I just don't think we have the ability to do those things. We just don't. But we have the ability, but we're really good at it in terms of using it. I think we're really good at educational outreach, and I think we can use it better as a tactic to make systemic change. I talk about in the past, I've talked about like Anonymous for the Voiceless, right? I don't like their approach simply because it's just trying to get people to make a lifestyle change. But I think if you can incorporate things like Anonymous for the Voiceless into a strategic campaign, say you have a first store you're going after, or horse carriage company you're going after, like, could you imagine if instead of a cube around animal agriculture, you're doing a line of people outside of a fur store all showing fur undercover footage from fur farms? Or could you imagine people like walking alongside horse-drawn carriages with their TVs showing
yeah.
you know what I mean? And so everyone's got to watch it while they're sitting on a carriage. Like, how long will those carriage horses companies last? I don't know. So there's interesting ways I think we can use our educational outreach skills as a tactic to create change. I don't think that educational outreach component alone is going to work. It's got to be coupled with protests and disruptions and letter writing and emails and petitions and laws and all that stuff. That's how I think educational outreach can be used successfully as a grassroots movement.
Yeah, it's a piece of the puzzle. Yeah, and so you mentioned fur, and the fur campaign is really picking up, or it's we're seeing them drop like dominoes, and it's really exciting to see, but also to be mindful that we shouldn't let go of this momentum. We have to keep at it so they don't just rise from the ashes, so to speak. And so something that I've been grappling with is, when we're at these protests, we're yelling about fur, and then someone comes around, it's like, you're wearing leather shoes, and then, well, we know we're not, and so I'm like, okay, people see that animal skins are involved in making all of these other materials. So at what point, so we get one large corporation to drop, like we targeted pressure campaign, go after that one company for that one thing, and then we move on to the next. And at what point can one go back and say, okay, now we're coming after you for down or wool or leather or whatever is next on the list? Are we prolonging how long it's going to take for them to just drop using animals in the supply chain to begin with, by going after fur each and every company and then going back leather each and every company? Just what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I don't think we're prolonging it. I think as animal rights and vegans, animal rights activists, we have this weird thought, and I'm certainly guilty of this, that like if we just fight against animal use long enough, the whole system will collapse, and the next day this entire vegan world will pop up in its place, which sounds totally ridiculous if you say it out loud. But that's like, I don't know, that's how I was brought up in the movement, that like we need to fight against animal abuse and animal use, and if we do anything less than that, we're compromising and we're sellouts and this, that, and other thing. But it's just not realistic. Like, we're a fraction. I mean, actual vegans and animal rights activists are a fraction of a percent of the world's population. Like, do we really think that a fraction of a percentage is going to be able to topple the world's largest industries all at once? Like, it's just not going to happen. And so if you look at how other movements handle these situations, they set up the goalposts, they get everyone to reach those goalposts, and then they move them and make them reach the next time, and then they make all the corporations reach the goalposts again and again and again. Like, I don't think you could go to a company like Canada Goose, for instance, and be like, okay, you use fur, you use wool, you use down, you use leather, you need to become a completely vegan corporation overnight. It would be great if you could, but a corporation that size just isn't going to do it. It's like a death sentence. And so you're either trying to shut down Canada Goose, which fine, if that's what you want to try to do, go for it. But or you realize that like this is going to be a long fight, and we can get them to stop using fur in a year, and then we can go back, and say, okay, now we're going to do leather or down, and now we're going to go leather, and now we're going to go wool, and make these corporations shift. I think that I think that's the unfortunate reality of how we have to make social change. I know everyone hates baby steps or steps in general, but like you have to take them. There's no other way. But I do think when you set those initial goalposts, in this case it was fur, you get all these companies to get rid of fur, and they realize what a headache you were. In a year when you come back and be like, all right, you're doing down. We're going after you for down next. They know what's coming. And they're like, I don't want to deal with these people in my offices and in my stores and at my house. Like, how do we adjust this so that we can just phase out the down? And then, you make change that way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. And I think there it's still mind blowing how fur just now by default, or for the most part, from what I'm aware of, has that negative association. Whereas I think leather, we also are so accustomed to seeing cows part of the food supply chain that and the end product is so different from the actual skin of the cow who the material came from versus fur. It still has that feel to it. So I think it might be easier to make that connection. And these are, like you said, little things that we need to take into account, like human behavior and the economics and what's going to be most effective approach to go about it.
I think, with fur, there's fur is looked at as a luxury item that you don't really need unless you're living in some like remote winter area. I think people have a hard time being like, well, I need this. So it's
also
always
on the
been
trim. It's not even doing anything.
Yeah. So I think I think for a long time it's been seen as a luxury item, and it feels like, I think people look at leather and be like, they have this like rosy picture where it's like, we're using all the animal, that we've killed, and that's much better than just the skin off of a minker, which obviously is bullshit. But I think that's why things like leather are a harder sell and wool's a harder sell, because it's like, oh, we're just trimming the sheep and we're not killing them. They're living fine lives. It's this, kind of fictional rosy picture of what the wool industry is. But I think that's why those issues are a little bit tougher.
Totally. Yeah. That's a valid point as well. And just, it's like, okay, now that we're outside the store protesting fur, going on to the next one. And then, like you said, before long, we back like, hey, I see you have got leather on your racks. And they're like, oh no, they're back. And who knows, maybe they'll drop it quicker. And this is also where all the companies that are developing replacements to animal skins in the textile industry, where they are coming in and filling in these holes that will be left once, or as they transition away from using animals to more, environmental friendly and ethical options. So yeah, it's fascinating to see the creativity.
Yeah, and we see this in the climate movements, right? We see pressure campaigns against banks for financing projects, and it wasn't like you have to end all financing of things that you support that upset that are contributing to the climate crisis. It was like, okay, you're supporting and funding like mountaintop removal. We need all these banks now, go after all these banks to get them to stop funding mountaintop removal. After that, it was on to like coal mining, and got a bunch of banks to stop funding coal mining. And now it's like, we need you to stop doing fossil fuel extraction projects, like pipeline projects, like, Keystone and Line 3 and things like that. So they're successful in the way that they're doing that because they're not just going to these banks and be like, you have to stop doing everything. It's like, you will eventually stop doing everything, but we're going to present it to you in steps.
Yeah.
So that we can get these wins and start moving this process along. Because if you go to someone and it's like, you got to change your multi-billion-dollar corporation, you got to change everything about it, and you have to do it right now, it's idealistic, and I think that's what we want. It's not like a realistic way how the world works. And so I think we need to figure out ways to move that process along as quickly and efficiently as possible and successfully as possible. And I think at this point, that's how we do it, is we move these goalposts. And looking at these campaigns, some of these campaigns have been going on for a long time, 10, 20 years, like Neiman Marcus. But it really was like when this new resurgence of hard-hitting grassroots campaigns against the fur industry, you're seeing these places being picked off in a matter of weeks. So it's not like we're sitting around for years waiting for one corporation to change. In the current state of things, like you're getting them to change pretty quickly. And I think we're moving at a rapid pace that we haven't really seen in the United States in like 30 years, 25 years.
Yeah. And I think that also, like you said, a lot goes to those who remain steadfast in the value of grassroots activism and pressure campaigns and mobilizing those who really care and wanted to create change. And then it's not, like you said, it's a very small percentage of the people who are showing up, but still being effective. So if just from an efficiency standpoint, this is working, and imagine what increased resources into this particular approach could do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so one thing that, and recently there was the Animal Liberation Conference, ALC in Berkeley, and the activists who shut down one of the slaughterhouses that supplies Arby's, and I think it was Arby's, Chick-fil-A, one of the two, and they shut it down, and which was a really grand sight. And of course activists got arrested. It was a planned arrest, and it was a brave move, and it was admirable. And of course, I have immense respect and support for the activists who went ahead and put their freedom on the line for the cause. But I'm also wondering that we have a limited pool of vegans, even limited pool of animal rights activists. And when these really dedicated, passionate people are prosecuted, they go to jail, and then they are going to be restricted in the activism they can do further down the line. Do you think that these actions could be a hindrance to either mobilizing more people to participate because they see that, in order to be a good activist, I need to get arrested? Or are we decreasing our numbers by having people take these admirable risks, but then it's still coming at a cost of those who are actually able to go out and take action?
Yeah, I think there's a cost benefit analysis that needs to be done with all of these actions, and I'm hoping and assuming that that's being done. For me, I mean, I really like strategic actions and campaigns, and so yeah, that's great that those people went and did those actions, and like my hat's off to them. It's a hard thing to like go to jail, even if it's just for a few hours. But my question is like, okay, what's next? Are we going after Arby's now? Are we going after Chick-fil-A? Are there sustained campaigns against them? Or are we just like walking away from this? And if we're just walking away, then it makes me think, okay, what is the cost benefit analysis of doing something like this? Was it worth it? Was it for a photo opportunity, which is a reasonable, reason, an acceptable reason, I think, to do arrestable situations. You can do photo ops, you can do something for the media, you can do it to shut something down, but for me, it's like, what's the end goal? And so I'm not sure what the end goal is here. I'm not sure if they have one. I don't know about it, which doesn't mean there isn't one. I'm just not familiar with everything that DXC.
My understanding was it was an overarching shutdown factory farms move.
Yeah.
And like you said, is it going to be going after just this one Chick-fil-A supplier, or is it going to be going after all fast food chain suppliers? I'm not familiar with, but that's a valid point, is to evaluate, okay, what are we going to do next? And
right. And I think when you get arrested, I've been arrested a bunch, like 12 times or something, and every arrest situation is different. So I don't know what their situation is. But generally speaking, in the United States, when you're arrested, you're put onto like pretrial conditions, which are is like probation before you're found guilty. It's basically saying, all right, we think you've done something wrong. We're going to put you on trial for it. But in the meantime, you don't get in trouble again. Otherwise, we're going to let you out of jail on like a good faith type of thing, that you're not going to go out and do something arrestable again. And it's up to you. You can go out and get arrested again. There's people that continually do it over and over and over again. But the consequences become worse and worse for you if you're found guilty, or you have to take a deal. So, you're looking at anywhere from a few months of these pretrial situations, or you're looking at years. I mean, there's the direct action everywhere leadership, like Wayne and Priya, from my understanding, they've been on pretrial restrictions for years, waiting to go on trial or finish this case around I believe it was turkeys that they liberated. I was put on pretrial conditions. Obviously, my case was a lot different and was a lot bigger. But we were arrested in May of 2004. We went on trial in 2005. We had a mistrial and had to start over in 2006. So we were on pretrial conditions for almost 2 years. Then I was incarcerated for 3.5 years. I was put into a halfway house for 6 months. I was put onto probation for 3 years after that. I mean, it was almost 10 years of conditions and being watched and monitored by the government because of being arrested. And again, my case was a lot bigger than whatever these folks are going to face. But I think we have to stop and think like, is this worth it? I'm all for people getting arrested if that's what people want to do. If you've made that just a decision on your own and you feel prepared to do it, then do it. Like, I'm not here to tell you not to. I'm here to just simply suggest, make sure you think it's worth it. And again, that's not my decision to make. It's up to you all that are making that decision.
Yeah, that was very well said. And so another question that I do have is regarding welfare laws. And we talk a lot about liberation. We talk a lot about baby steps. Where do welfare laws come in? So with California's Prop 12 and just, it's celebrated for, which it's interesting because for me, if as someone who really cares about animals, it's something that we're like, yes, it passed. But then when you think of it, it's like, wait, this required people to really put in so many resources and fight for like bare minimum space to stand, which but I also see value in how welfare laws essentially, did away with the Ringling Brothers, and like it was kind of getting things started, get the ball rolling. It's like, okay, people are going to start thinking about, oh wait, of course they need more space, and then they vote for it, and then slowly, like, we grow the size such that it's not feasible or profitable to have these operations go on, and eventually phase out. So that is an argument that I hear, but there's also that welfare versus abolitionist debate, and I wanted to hear what your opinions on either side or one side of the argument is.
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I think for me, my heart is in liberation, and welfare laws. Some laws that are being passed, I think everyone that's working on them probably has that desire for liberation in them. Like, I don't think anyone's sitting there thinking, I think an inch bigger on this cage is enough. I think that's how they present it, but I don't think anyone, I hope, isn't, that's not where they're at. But for me, like, I want to work on things that are rooted in a liberatory framework. I want liberation. And so I understand how a welfare law fits into a large NGO strategy. But it's not something I'm interested in working on. I don't have it in me, and I don't have the heart to be like, I'm just going to work on this thing. I worked on a legislative thing in the 90s, and it was, I didn't do a lot on it, but I helped collect signatures and so forth and so on. And like, it was to ban bear baiting, bear baiting of bears, where hunters would put a thing up in the tree. They'd sit there, they'd pile literally stacks of donuts and honey at the bottom and wait for a bear to come eat them and then shoot them. And so there was trying to pass a law to stop that. And I mean, I think it spent millions of dollars to try to get this law passed, and eventually passed. Like, I think anyone would be like, that's awful, I'd vote against that. But then like within a year it was challenged. And then I think like the politician that introduced the bill was then left their position or didn't get nominated or voted in again. And then the law was thrown out because that person was gone, wasn't there to fight for it. And then, and then I think eventually years later it got put back in. I don't really know what happened to it. But after that process, I'm like, God, there's an enormous amount of resources just to stop a handful of hunters from putting donuts down and shooting bears while they eat them. I can't imagine the amount of resources used to pass something like this in California against the animal agriculture industry. California is one of the largest states that, for in the animal agriculture industry, like the
Yeah, it's
power that they had to
interesting.
fight against would have been millions and millions and millions of dollars just to get like an inch bigger
Yeah.
of a cage or an enrichment toy. It's just, and that's why I'm like, that's great for these large NGOs that have that money to spend. But the grassroots movement just doesn't have that kind of money and resources and power to change these things. And so I just don't think we should concentrate on them. You mentioned Ringling Brothers. That was by and large a grassroots effort, and that was smart. It was rooted in a liberatory framework, and they knew what they were doing, and it worked really well. You see laws passing like this throughout Europe around the fur industry, again, presenting it as kind of a welfare thing, but the people doing it from a grassroots perspective, rooted in liberation, and they won their things, and it's great. And so like fur farms are banned and things like that. So we have the capability to do it in a smaller scale. And I think as long as it's rooted in the idea of liberation, I'm for it. But I just don't have it in my heart to spend my years of activism as I get old, trying to get an inch bigger for a chicken in a cage. I just don't want the cage. I don't want the farm.
Totally. No. Yeah, that's so true. It's like, I mean, if that were to be presented on a ballot that I'm filling out, of course I'm going to vote, for bigger space, but I'm not going to spend my time and resources dedicated to that piece of legislation, but rather things that could abolish the cage to begin with.
I think we see, and even just because it's voted on and it passes doesn't mean it becomes a bill. It gets peeled, it gets overthrown, it gets, overrun by lobbyists. Like all these things happen all the time. We spend
And
tens of
enforcement
millions
seems
of dollars.
pretty poor too. Like, no.
For sure. And then,
Enforcing, who's
then what
overseeing
happens?
it? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we do need all hands on deck doing all the things in a very strategic way, like you pointed out.
I think so.
And so what do you think our movement needs more of? You've sort of touched upon this throughout our conversation, but just to wrap things up, just, your last tidbits of wisdom, what do you think our movement needs more of in the current climate?
Sure. I speak from my own personal experiences. I'm certainly not saying I'm right. I could be wrong. I'm totally open to that possibility. So to that end, a couple of things I think the grassroots animal rights movement needs to do is engage in tough conversations, have these conversations where we challenge one another, and we can do that respectfully, and have the ability to say, you know what, I think you're wrong, and this is why, without everyone jumping on each other and attacking people into submission. I think those big conversations are vitally important, and we can't do them on social media. We need to be doing them face to face, so that we can build friendships and we can build trust and we can build community. And that's the second piece. I think we need to build community. We need to, give people the tools to win these fights, but we also have to make sure that people enjoy winning these fights. Everyone likes to win, so let's give them opportunities to win. But also let's give people the opportunity to be part of a community that's fun. No one likes to sit around with a bunch of people that are losing and that are no fun. So let's make sure we have things for people to engage in that are fun. Let's do movie nights. Let's hang out. Let's go to a restaurant. Let's do letter writing nights. All these things can be enjoyable. And I think we need to think about how we root our strategizing. And so for me, I root my strategizing and organizing and philosophy in the idea of collective liberation, the idea that all the movements are connected. And it doesn't mean that I'm telling you shouldn't fight for animal rights. I think you absolutely should fight for animal rights, but do that with the understanding that animal rights isn't a movement in and of itself. Like it is part of a much bigger movement. The idea that we can't win animal rights without winning human rights, without winning the environmental issues, and they can't win without us. And I think when we all come to that understanding, that we're all connected, the better off we're going to be, and really focus on not fighting for animal liberation, but fighting for liberation. Those are just a few of the things.
Just like we'll start with the little pointers and then we'll go from there. And that reminds me one of your videos about the environmental movement and like the fighting between animal rights and the environmental movement, where it's like, hey, instead of just saying you're not an environmentalist if you still eat meat, but also acknowledge that they also sort of need the awareness from the animal rights side to progress their cause for a livable planet as well, then we just bring everyone in instead of pushing people away, which, personally, I've also struggled with that. I'm like, how can you talk about the planet when you're eating a steak? And then I saw that video and I'm like, I guess he has got a point.
I don't disagree. It's weird. I mean, yeah, it's weird that veganism and animal rights and that those type of fights aren't front and center in the environmental movement, but I also understand why they're not. So we can either choose to work with our similarities and passions, or we can choose to push each other away because of our differences. And that just doesn't make any sense to me.
And is there, before I have the closing question, is there anything that you wanted to address that you didn't get to? A question that you've wanted to be asked but was never asked ever, and you'd like me to ask you right now?
No, I think I'm doing good so far. What do you got? What's the last one?
All right, well, the last one is just, again, kind of putting mentorship at the core. You're in a room full of new, excited, but also nervous and scared activists, don't know where to start, or might be scared to take these high-risk actions, or some might be brave and they just want to do all of the things. So what advice would you have to give this room of aspiring world changers?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much what I've already said. I'm really good at repeating myself, so I'll do that again. But I do think that
we'll take it.
All right, perfect. So I think it's really important that people, whether you're a new activist or an older activist, is to figure out what you're good at, what inspires you, what moves you, and learn those skills to the best of your abilities, and then figure out what you want to plug that into and how you can plug that into. And so, if you want to work on fur, or you want to work on circuses, or you want to work on animal agriculture, and those things aren't in your vicinity, there's two options for you. You can build those communities up yourself, or with the power of the internet, you can literally find organizations anywhere in the world that need your help. Maybe maybe you're really good at making videos. Find a handful of organizations that are exciting for you. And reach out to them and offer your services, and you can start to become involved in campaigning that way. There's really inspiring stories of people that just, in their communities, that didn't have anyone else to work with. I did an interview with Liza Oliver on my YouTube channel, who I was really inspired by, and she was like, well, I live in a town of like 30,000 people in Wesleyan, Massachusetts. I want to ban fur here, but there's no one here to work on it. So I'm just going to figure out how you put a ban on the ballot, and do it myself. And she did it. She made allies with local environmental student groups, and pushed anti-fur messages through an environmental lens, even though she was coming at it from the animal rights lens. And she got the vote. She got it on the ballot, and she won. And she pretty much did it by herself. And through that process, she was able to build coalitions with other people. Now she's working on getting fur banned in the state of Massachusetts. So, as I said, there's two kind of avenues you can do. Find people to work with anywhere in the world through the internet, or if you're not finding people locally in your community, you have the power to do it yourself. And that's the beauty of grassroots do-it-yourself organizing. You really only need a few people to get these things rolling. And I always think of SHAC, which looked like, thousands and thousands of people throughout the United States working on this campaign. But at the heart of it was, myself, who did a lot of graphic design and web design and organizing. You had Kevin, who was an amazing strategist and public speaker. And you had Lauren, who was like amazing smarts around the law and also amazing organizer. And so we had all the different pieces we needed to come together and form this little core group along with a couple of other people to really make something magical that we felt really special about doing, and we thought was really important. And so that's my long-winded way of saying, figure out what you're good at.
Yeah.
Use it.
Figure out your life and get it together.
Get it together. But you can make change, even with the smallest amount of people, as long as you're passionate and dedicated and willing to put in the hard work.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jake, for taking the time. So appreciated. And you've really left us a lot of fascinating points to consider moving forward and to really really progress the animal rights movement. So I think you're going to be, your story and your resources are going to be a source of mentorship to a lot of our members, and can't wait to see how many people you keep going on to inspire. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate you having me.
If you enjoyed this chat as much as I did, be sure to check out his YouTube channel, The Cranky Vegan, and keep up with his tidbits of wisdom. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode. Please be sure to rate and review the podcast. It really helps get the word out, and the more people find out about it, the more they can be inspired by the fabulous guests we have on. And that can only turn into actionable change for the animals, right? Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Animal Activism Mentorship, where you can keep up with the pod as well as all things AAM. One more reminder that you can sign up for a free mentor to help you with your activism at animalactivismmentorship.com. So if you are waiting for a sign to get active for the animals, here you go. And lastly, remember that animal liberation is no easy undertaking. It takes all of us to come together, support one another, uplift each other, stay positive, focused, and be as effective as we can to put our best selves forward and create the world we wish to see for all Earthlings. Until next time.